What is a chief mission officer? What should we and can we be doing for the small farms across the state of Wisconsin, for the small manufacturers across the state of Wisconsin, and for the millions of individuals who are employed and can be employed in fulfilling careers in our state? How do we make the career dream a reality for everyone? Our guest today on the Tech Ed podcast is the Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, Missy Hughes. Welcome to the Tech Ed podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Back this week with another phenomenal episode of the Tech Ed podcast. I am your host, Matt Kirkner, and I have been looking forward to today's guest for some time. Incredibly interesting background, somebody who's leading economic development in the state of Wisconsin. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the Tech Ed podcast the Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, Secretary Missy Hughes. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Matt.
So we're going to dive right into some really interesting discussions. Your background, as I mentioned in the intro, is really fascinating to me. And before we get into discussing the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, I want to chat about that background a little bit. Now, you took the position of secretary in 2019, so it's been about 2 years, but previously you were at Organic Valley, which is a brand I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with, and you were there for over 18 years. And part of that time, you had just an interesting title called Chief Mission Officer. So my question is, what is a Chief Mission Officer? And is this the role we should be seeing in more private business?
Well, so my job at the Organic Valley as Chief Mission Officer was to be in our executive management meetings or our board meetings and remind everybody what our mission was when we were making business decisions, making sure that we were thinking about things in the long haul. We have a 50-year plan. Our farmers are still going to be milking 50 years from now. And so making sure that we kept the mission first and foremost in our mind. And the mission of Organic Valley is to help farmers stay on their farms, to help them pass them on to next generation, and to help them succeed.
And what's interesting is we see so many changes in the world of agriculture, corporate farms getting bigger and bigger. And in many ways, it's an issue. It's an issue and a challenge with more and more farmers, in some cases being pushed out of their livelihood that can go back generations and generations. So what a phenomenal mission that you had there at Organic Valley. So now you move into the position of the Secretary and Chief Executive Officer of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. For those in our audience who may be unfamiliar with exactly what the WEDC does, what is your mission at the WEDC?
Well, the transition is really interesting because, when I was at Organic Valley, I was working for farmers, and for a lot of Wisconsin farmers, we had about 450 farmers in Wisconsin that we were taking care of. And so it was really important to me to recognize the importance of farming for our rural communities and what strength they bring to the overall fabric of the United States. So when I went to be secretary at WEDC, I really thought I was going to be championing the farmers and agriculture and rural economies. And instead, what I found is this opportunity to be the champion for the whole economy of Wisconsin, whether it's small businesses or our large industry, our farmers, our Main Street businesses. It's just really been kind of a spectacular transition.
And you're an individual who, spent time in the private sector, and that's a bit unique for somebody in public service. In fact, for a lot of people in public service, we see folks that spend entire careers in some cases working for the government. And you had that really interesting background, an 18-year career at Organic Valley in private industry. How do you think, Secretary Hughes, that background in private industry influences the work you do today at the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation?
Well, I really understand how businesses work and think. And so when, we're developing programs at WEDC or talking about the impact of the pandemic on businesses, I was able to use that experience to really inform what we were doing. And I think that kind of cross-pollination between the private sector and the public sector is really, really important in order to enable that better decision-making and things like that. The other piece is in business, we move fast and you don't have time to do things over years. It's usually over months and days that you're trying to act. And so it's been really fun to bring that urgency. And, especially with the pandemic, it was incredibly important that we were moving fast and there was no time to waste. And so I think I was able to bring that experience and that mindset to WEDC.
And that certainly serves your work, as you put it, to cross-pollinate the public and private sector and to be able to move at the speed that you're able to, given that private sector background. I know that you went through recently a realignment to make sure that you were even more responsive to the small and mid-sized businesses. So tell us about specifically what is the WEDC doing to make sure that you are benefiting not just the large businesses in Wisconsin, but the small and mid-sized ones as well?
We're still learning is what I will say. One of the things that we have the benefit of doing at WEDC is helping big businesses expand. If a business wants to add 500 employees with a big project, we've got their back and we support that with things like tax credits and programs like that. But when the pandemic hit, we really found ourselves saying, okay, how do we help the small businesses of Wisconsin and how do we find them? If you just drive down your main street or even drive on I-94, you're going to see businesses whizzing by you. I call them the little white van. And so we wanted to figure out, how do we reach those businesses? And we worked with our network of partners, local and regional economic development agencies and the small business development centers that are on every campus in Wisconsin. And by using our network of partners, we were able to really reach and help small businesses. So a lot of the work that we did in the last 18 months has been deploying ARPA, which is the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and the CARES Act funding, these big swaths of federal funding that have come through. We've deployed over $600 million worth of grants to small businesses all around Wisconsin. And these are small grants, right? These are $2,500 or $5,000. But we wanted to get those dollars into the hands of small business owners because we knew that they would make those dollars last and they would put them to work. And indeed, that's what we've really seen.
And $600 million, $2,500 or $5,000 at a time, that is a lot of support for small to mid-sized business owners and their employees in the state of Wisconsin. It is interesting that you addressed the pandemic. Who would have guessed in 2019 when you accepted this position that we would have been on this roller coaster ride that all of us have been on for the last 18 months? From an economic development perspective, what are 2 or 3 lessons that you think we've learned from the pandemic? And how can we better protect our economy from that type of disruption in the future?
I think what we've learned first and foremost is that for someone to get up in the morning and go to work is really hard. There's a lot of obstacles that you have to overcome in order to make that happen. First, you got to have breakfast. So you have to have food security. You need to have things in your kitchen that you can eat for breakfast. And you need to have stable housing so that you've got that kitchen, you've got a place to sleep at night. You need to have good childcare or good schooling where your kids are going to be safe during the day and you can afford that and it's accessible. And then you need to have transportation to get to work. So all of these things are really important to have a functioning economy. And there's a lot of places in Wisconsin where we didn't have those things really set up and ready for people to be able to overcome in their day-to-day life, even before the pandemic. And so what we really saw during the pandemic was everybody was affected by that. We saw like a portfolio hit, right? Where all of a sudden nobody had childcare. And it's like, oh, that's really something that you need to have in order to be able to go to work. So as we come out of the pandemic at WEDC, we're really focused on what does it take to comprehensively get somebody to work and give them the opportunity to participate in the economy? And how can we help develop those things and make that happen? And it doesn't mean that WEDC is responsible for childcare or for transportation. It's how do we connect the dots with the rest of state government and the rest of the folks who are thinking about those things so we can make sure this is all happening. It's kind of like having a bunch of cooks in the kitchen and making sure that everybody's doing their part so that we deliver a really great meal to the folks sitting in the dining room.
Very, very important work as we move into this comprehensive approach, as you put it, to getting people to work, and especially at a time when there's such a mismatch, isn't there, between available employment and opportunities for people, and then their wherewithal or ability in many cases to get to those opportunities, especially as that world of work continues to change. Now, one of the many ways in which that world of work is changing is a rising level of entrepreneurship and more individuals seeking to take or taking themselves an entrepreneurial path. Why do you think we're seeing so many people now think about being an entrepreneur, taking on the challenges and the benefits and opportunities of maybe owning or running a small business? Why do you think so many individuals are considering that option?
The first thing I think we need to do is step back and acknowledge how cool that is. Because when I spoke with some economists right at the beginning of the pandemic, those economists were really worried that there was going to be a retraction in innovation and entrepreneurship, that people were going to kind of crawl under their beds and not want to come back out. And instead, what we've seen is people saying, you know what, I've always wanted to do this hustle, or I've been doing this on the side. I'm going to try and make this my full-time gig. And so it's really exciting to see that. And I think it's a combination of people, if they were laid off from their work, they had the time and the energy to put into their passionate ideas. I think, people have lost their jobs. Unfortunately, their jobs have just gone away. And so they're looking for a way to be successful. And I think it's just this kind of, if not now, then when spirit that we've seen kind of come up from the pandemic. And I think it's really exciting and will really spur the next generation of our economy forward in that, we'll really see these small businesses, which often are the source of jobs and more build in the economy. We're really going to see them launch forward.
And I think it's interesting you use, slang terms like hustle and full-time gig, which are now more and more becoming part of just our regular vocabulary as people look at so many different ways to create economic development for their own households, for themselves, and for their future. But it certainly is a changing world of work, and it's a group of individuals that are seeking great opportunities through entrepreneurship. Are there things that the WEDC can do and is doing to support those efforts?
Well, first and foremost, I'm a champion for innovation. Let's get out and do these things. And I think supporting each other in taking risk is something that we can really help with. And, reminding people that taking risk is about building and creating and doing things that are exciting for the future. So I think that there's always a piece of WEDC that needs to say, we're going to have your back if you try and do that. And a lot of what we do is provide the technical assistance or support organizations that provide that technical assistance to new business owners. So if you're a business owner and you're passionate about the bread that you're making, you might not know how to do a business plan. You might not know how to access financing. You might not know about cash flow. So if we can provide you with that support, then you'll be all the more successful. Focus on your fantastic bread that you're making, and we'll have your back to be able to do the other things and to learn how to do the other things. And hopefully then we can also teach somebody how to have an employee. Because one of the things that we see in our small businesses, especially our Black and Brown communities, is that the step towards having employees is a huge step. And all of a sudden you're taking on somebody else's livelihood and their responsibilities for their family. So we want to make sure that that happens and that it's successful when it does happen.
So whether it's learning about cash flow, it's learning about how to build a effective business plan, how to finance a business, to your point, how to have an employee, a lot of things that, many employers may just take for granted. After a while, you just get good at those things and you forget that if an individual is just working their way into the entrepreneurial economy, they may not have those backgrounds. Another thing that we always took for granted, I think, here in the state of Wisconsin and across the country was an available workforce. It really doesn't matter, Secretary Hughes, where we go in the state, we see help wanted signs, and they are literally everywhere. So especially in the world of manufacturing, where I made my living for 23 years, there's an incredible lack of skilled talent. Often manufacturers are hiring from a pool of inexperienced or unskilled applicants. How do private employers need to change their thinking about their role in providing training to these new employees, people maybe not possessing tremendous amounts of manufacturing experience, and providing continuing education to their employees?
Well, I think the first thing is for a manufacturer or a transportation company, again, often you didn't go into that business thinking you needed to be an expert in human resources. And what we're seeing now is a lot of businesses need to gain that expertise. They need to understand, okay, what benefits am I offering? How, to your point, Matt, how am I doing training? And, how do I have a flexible schedule for my workers? Because that's what people are looking for. And so the first thing I would say is if you're a business owner and you're experiencing some of these challenges, look for some technical assistance in what's happening in the world now when it comes to human resources and what are the solutions that you might deploy in your workplace. We're seeing employers offer more training. And what I've experienced is that employers are really dedicated to keeping their staff and offering them those opportunities. So where I see employers doing things like automation and increasing productivity, they're also able to offer their employees higher skilled jobs and safer jobs. And they're really excited to be able to offer that to their folks. So I think that the employers in Wisconsin are recognizing that the supply of workers is a real challenge, and how do they need to change in order to access the supply and keep and retain those employees that they have right now.
So the supply of workers, a real challenge indeed. And we are seeing employers all over the state of Wisconsin start to change their thinking about the importance of providing incumbent worker training and training for folks that have maybe been with them a month or two. And in many cases, people that have been in their companies for 20 plus years. And it doesn't matter where they fall into that spectrum. There's tremendous opportunities to upskill the existing workforce in the state of Wisconsin and across the country. Now, you mentioned earlier, Secretary Hughes, the $600 million that you have put to work, in many cases on behalf of small to mid-sized businesses. Are there economic resources available to help, whether it's a large company or a small to mid-sized company, offset the cost of continuing education or training for their incumbent workforce?
So we have resources available to help businesses if they choose to do training. The Department of Workforce Development, which is the real wheelhouse for workforce development, has what's called fast forward grants, and those help businesses with training. I would also encourage businesses to reach out to their local tech colleges about training. In Wisconsin, over 100 years ago, as we saw kids coming from the farms and heading into the cities, into more industrial work, we created the tech college system in order to help upskill those workers and have them ready for industry. And so today we have a really incredible network of tech colleges. And I would encourage employers to reach right out to their local tech colleges and see how they can team up with the tech college and get the training that their employees need. I would also, Matt, if you're an employer, you need to be thinking about the soft skills of your workers also and the situations that they find themselves in. They might need support when it comes to transportation or childcare or food security. I've had a lot of employers be really frustrated that they train somebody for a week and then that person doesn't come back in and just kind of disappears. And we're starting to think that a lot of that is because those folks are in crisis. And so if you can understand what your employees are going through, if you're making that investment in training them, you should also probably make the investment in understanding what other assistance they might need. And if they do need assistance, the state is here to help with that. We've got through WEDC, through the Department of Workforce Development, through, I could give you another alphabet soup of agencies. We've got resources ready to help those folks. And we're ready to help the businesses find them and to help get those deployed to the employees.
So in as much as the shortage of skilled talent here in the state of Wisconsin is a crisis for businesses large and small, there's a crisis on the home front as well for many potential employees and finding ways to support them as they look to enter or continue their way in the world of work. Really, really important. And I really appreciate your reference and your suggestion that our businesses, as they look to upskill their existing talent, look in the direction of the technical colleges, every single one of which, by the way, has a workforce outreach element to it. So this is something that's right in their wheelhouse. It's something that they do. We're big fans of technical education. We are big fans of the Wisconsin Technical College system. We're also big fans of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation Fabrication Laboratory Grant Programs, commonly called Fab Labs, here in the state of Wisconsin. And especially since the legislature several years ago in the biennial budget broadened the allowable solutions to include Industry 4.0 level advanced manufacturing equipment. I know you're a huge supporter of our Fab Labs in the state of Wisconsin. What do you hope we can achieve by building the Fab Labs here in the state?
Well, so for your listeners who don't know what the Fab Labs are, the first thing I want to just explain is that these are kind of, if you can imagine when you were a kid and there was a wood shop or the art room at your school, this Fab Lab is that on steroids. There's computers, there's 3D printers, there's equipment to learn how to work with metal and how to then make a robot work with a robot. So the Fab Labs are a program that we support. And the goal is to get students excited about making things, about using the computers and the printers to be able to develop their skills so that when a student walks onto the floor of a factory in an advanced manufacturing facility, they feel at home. Right. And our kids are really ready for a lot of that with video games that they play and all that they do. But this really kind of gives them that tactical understanding of what they can achieve when they go out into the workforce. I'm not a big fan of saying kids who are 10th graders should pick what their career is, but I am a big fan of getting them excited about learning and getting them to understand that there's really cool things they can do and build and make once they enter the workforce in Wisconsin.
And I'm really impressed by the fact that you reference things like additive manufacturing, like robots working with robots, like computers, whether they're being used for design, being used to control manufacturing equipment, and the role that our Fab Labs can play in preparing our young people and students and really people of all ages, because in many cases they're open to the community as well, for careers in manufacturing so that they do feel at home when they get there. Technical education is absolutely evolving, and that evolution has been fascinating to watch. It's also been interesting to watch the role of the technical educator evolve over time. In as much as so many of our listeners are involved in technical education, many of them technical educators, teachers, instructors themselves, what can you share with them about the role they can play in economic development in the state of Wisconsin?
Well, it's really about creating that excitement for learning. And I've had the chance to go in Gateway Tech a couple different times, and it makes me want to go back to school. I'm like, forget about being the secretary of WEDC. I want to go build things and figure out how to do this. And that's where I think the educator can really come in and help to understand the full breadth of the different opportunities in Wisconsin, whether you want to be an airplane mechanic or whether you want to fly an airplane, or if you want to be a truck driver because you want to travel the country or you want to work on that engine. There's just all sorts of opportunities. And I think one of the challenges of living in a video game world is that you don't really understand these are real world skills that I can put to work and earn money and do things with. And so that the technical educator can be that bridge from your bedroom to the actual workplace where you're doing really cool things.
Without a doubt. And that bridge that those technical educators build between their students, between whatever comes next. And you and I agree, we shouldn't be telling a 10th grader necessarily, here's your career, or you need to choose your career. We just want them open. We want them to have different career pathways on their horizon, and whether they're going to direct to workforce, whether they're going to a technical college like Gateway. And by the way, I'm sure Brian Albrecht and his team would have you when you're ready to move out of your role as
Brian's
secretary.
Ready. He's definitely ready.
Without question. So those bridges are so very, very important that our technical educators are building across the state, in our high schools, in our technical colleges. There's other bridges we need to think about as well. And one of those bridges is the one between education and the world of industry. And I think you're in a perfect position to answer a question like this one because of your strong background in private industry. Do you think education and industry are as aligned as they should be or could be?
The first thing to keep in mind is that we're doing a really good job here in Wisconsin. We've got, I think the latest figures are about 3.9, 3.8% unemployment. So the reason we have a challenge with workforce is we've got everybody in the workforce and people are really working. But when it comes to education and industry, I think that there's always opportunities to be more aligned. And that's where we talked about the cross-pollination between government and industry. I think that can also happen at the education and industry level, where someone who works in food processing, if they're hands-on with the educators, they can really explain, hey, this is what needs to happen when you go into the food processing industry. This is the things we care about. Can you help teach that? And if you visit someplace like UW River Falls, you get a chance to see their dairy processing plant that they have on the campus, or the meat processing plant that they have on the campus. They're actually processing meat at UW River Falls, which I think is so awesome. So I think that we have done a lot of really good alignment. I think as we continue to think about advanced manufacturing and where we see some of our industry already going so far advanced, and we need to make sure that education is keeping up with that so that we're not 3 steps behind where the industry is.
Agreed. And making sure that we've got those solid relationships between educators and industrial employers and informing one another. One of the things that I always marvel at in our work, connecting education and industry, is how they really don't speak each other's language. And I spent 23 years as a manufacturing CEO, came over to the world of education about 5 or 6 years ago, and I had so much to learn. And it was intimidating sometimes to sit in a room with educators because they knew so much about education that I didn't know. And come to find out, the educators will tell me the same thing. It's really intimidating sometimes to sit in a world of industrial employers because they speak in a language that we don't know. So certainly the efforts that the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation and others are making to build those stronger alignments, to create more of a dialogue between educators and industry so that education and technical education in particular is keeping up with the advancements in industry. So very, very important. Secretary and CEO of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, Missy Hughes, is our guest on the Tech Ed podcast. We're going to use the remaining time that we have with her to talk about investing in the economic well-being of the future of Wisconsin. Now, the Wisconsin Tomorrow Report, which was published in June of 2020, is a comprehensive approach to economic development. And, quote, it is rooted in the economic well-being of our citizens. That comes right from that report. Secretary Hughes, how does the WEDC define economic well-being?
Well, economic well-being is really the idea that we want to look at how someone is succeeding from their own perspective. And we can often think about, well, if we create this institution and this institution and this institution, it'll trickle down and the individuals will have the opportunities and succeed. And economic well-being is really the idea. Let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's look at it from the individual's perspective. Do they have what they need to succeed? Do they have access to education and healthcare that they need? Do they have the community and infrastructure, whether it's childcare or broadband, these things that we really saw during the pandemic that we needed to bolster up? So it's trying to take a step back and say, what do we really want? And we want the individual Wisconsinite to succeed. And the goal is also to recognize that we have real challenges when it comes to economic equity in the state of Wisconsin. And we have folks who are succeeding, wildly succeeding, and we have folks who are not. And for those who are not, I want to look at it from their perspective and see what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis and how we might help support them.
So we are now a year and 5 months, a year and 4 months about into the Wisconsin Tomorrow Report. What are some of the key initiatives in that report, Secretary Hughes, that you individually are particularly proud of?
Well, what we were able to do in working with the governor's office and the rest of the administration was, as the dollars were being deployed and continued to be deployed from the CARES Act funding and from the American Rescue Plan Act funding, we were able to do it with a structure of economic well-being in mind. So the idea is that you're looking comprehensively at where do we need to deploy these resources. Like 6 months ago or 8 months ago, everything was focused on broadband and how do we make broadband work? Economic well-being helps us think about, okay, well, that's great. We have broadband. What about the digital divide? And what about the fact that we also need the tablets and the computers, and that we have kids who are schooling from their phone and doing their homework on their phone. How do we solve that issue? How do we make sure that the transportation is there? Because we're seeing restaurant owners have to go pick up their workers, or farmers have to go pick up their farm workers 10 miles away in order to get them to work because of the challenges in transportation and what we call the last mile. So what I'm really proud about is that we provided a framework with which we could start to deploy some of these resources and start to do it in a strategic, smart way.
And provided that framework in the scope of some really broad and extensive goals. Now, you've never been one to shy away from big goals. I'll just point out that one of the goals in the economic well-being efforts include what you call the Educate Everyone initiative. How does the WEDC intend to live out this particular plan and any specific outcomes that you're seeking? And then I think a final question on how will those outcomes be measured, in as much as measuring an outcome and setting goals that are measurable and that create ROI is important?
Well, that was a big question, but I love big questions. I love big goals, as you pointed out. I think that WEDC is one of the loudest voices for the economy in Wisconsin. And so one of our roles is to collectively say, what do we want our economy to look like? And we know that an economy that's driven by education, that provides the educational opportunities from birth all the way till death. Honestly, we need to all have a learning mindset and be thinking about how do we keep going? How do we continue to improve ourselves? And if we have that as part of our economy, we're going to grow. You can't avoid it. And so WEDC's role as being the voice of that economy, I think, is really critically important. And we're stepping into that. How do we measure things like that? We need to do it in a way that then again goes back to that economic well-being idea, that do people have the opportunity to get a high school diploma? Do they have the opportunity, if they want it, to go to a four-year college? What are we doing to provide that opportunity? Sometimes you can just measure these things through outcomes. We can say 29% of Wisconsinites have a four-year degree, and that's fantastic. But does it mean that the individual has that opportunity? We need to go back and measure that also.
Solid answer to a very big question. We're going to finish up our time with Secretary Missy Hughes with a really short question and a to-the-point question. And it's one that I love asking every one of our guests on the Tech Ed podcast. If you had one piece of advice that you would give to a sophomore in high school as they consider their future pathway, what would it be?
I think that the first thing I would say would be have some fun, because being a high school sophomore is a pretty fun time in your life. And in having that fun, start to think about what you care about. And if you can follow your career path with doing something that you care about, you will be successful. And so coming back to the first question, Matt, as Chief Mission Officer, I care about helping people. I care about making others successful. I care about food and our environment. And so all of those things wrapped up into a fantastic job called Chief Mission Officer. So I would say have some fun and think about what you care about in the world.
Helping people, caring about the people in the state of Wisconsin. These are the things that Secretary Missy Hughes cares about. And her advice for a high school sophomore: answer the question, what do you care about? And have some fun. We have certainly had some fun today, Missy, with you. It's been just a wonderful discussion around all the great things that you and the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation are doing for the state of Wisconsin on behalf of the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. So Missy Hughes, Secretary and CEO of the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, really appreciate you being with us today on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you liked this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.